December 16th, 1944. The morning mist hung heavy over the snow-covered forests of the Ardennes. As dawn broke over Belgium, the quiet that had settled over this supposedly peaceful sector was about to be shattered in a way that would catch the Allied High Command completely off guard. What happened in the hours and days that followed, and more importantly, what the Allied commanders said and did when they realized the true scale of the German attack, would become one of the most fascinating stories of command decision-making in the entire war. The Ardennes had been considered a rest area, a quiet sector where battle-worn divisions could recover and newly arrived units could get their bearings before being thrown into serious combat. General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, and his staff had made a calculated decision. They stretched their lines thin here because the terrain itself, with its dense forests, deep valleys, and limited road network, seemed to offer natural protection. Besides, their intelligence assessments repeatedly assured them that Germany simply didn't have the capability to launch a major offensive this late in the war. The Third Reich was dying. Everyone knew it, or so they thought. But before we go further into this incredible story, I want to ask you to do something. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of World War II's most critical moments, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss future videos about the crucial decisions that shape the war. Your comments are also invaluable, so let us know what you think as we go through this story. On the morning of December 16th, the first reports started trickling into Allied headquarters. They were fragmentary, confusing, and initially seemed routine. Some German activity in the Ardennes, attacks against the thinly held American positions. Nothing too alarming. But as the morning progressed, something began to feel different. The reports weren't stopping. They were intensifying. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, known as SHIEF, the atmosphere was initially one of business as usual. Eisenhower was at his headquarters in Versailles. It was supposed to be a relatively calm day. In fact, there was even a wedding reception planned for that evening. One of Eisenhower's aides was getting married, and the social calendar had been arranged accordingly, but the gods of war had other plans. Brigadier General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's chief of intelligence, began receiving the reports. Strong was a careful, methodical officer, not prone to panic or exaggeration. But as he read through the incoming intelligence, his usual calm demeanor began to crack. He conferred with Major General Tom Betts, and together they realized they needed to brief the Supreme Commander immediately. What they were seeing wasn't a local counterattack or a spoiling raid. The Germans were hitting the Ardennes with serious force. When Strong appeared at Eisenhower's door, witnesses later recalled that his composure was visibly shaken. This was unusual for Strong, and Eisenhower noticed it immediately. Strong laid out what they knew. A series of powerful German attacks had commenced at dawn against the weakest link in the Allied front. The targets were a thinly dispersed cavalry group and the inexperienced 106th Division, which had only recently arrived in the theater. The 106th had been placed in this supposedly quiet sector specifically to keep them out of harm's way while they gained experience. Now they were taking the full brunt of what appeared to be a major German offensive. Strong's assessment was cautious but clear. This attack likely posed a serious threat to First Army. At this early stage, German intentions were still unclear. The fragmentary reports didn't yet paint a complete picture. But Eisenhower's reaction was immediate and, as it would turn out, exactly right. From the very first reports, Eisenhower was convinced that the German attack was a serious attempt to split the Allied front. His reasoning was simple but profound. Why else would the Germans bother attacking in an area that led nowhere and contained no tangible objectives unless they had something much bigger in mind? This gut instinct This immediate recognition of the threat's scale would prove to be one of Eisenhower's finest moments as a commander. While others around him were still debating whether this was a major offensive or merely a local counterattack, Eisenhower saw the danger clearly. He didn't have complete intelligence. He didn't have a full picture of German strength or intentions. But he understood that this was no minor operation. General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, was also at Eisenhower's headquarters that day. The two generals weighed the situation together. Bradley was more cautious, more non-committal in his assessment. After all, the attacked sector fell under his command responsibility, and he had previously dismissed warnings about a possible German offensive in the Ardennes. Just days earlier, when Strong had warned of a possible German spoiling attack, Bradley had brushed it off, saying he had already made provisions to reinforce the Ardennes if necessary. He had even said with confidence that now seemed misplaced, "Let them come." But Eisenhower wasn't waiting for complete certainty. He made his first critical decision. He ordered the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions to be alerted for urgent deployment to the Ardennes. These were elite units, battle-hardened paratroopers who could be trusted to hold critical positions. They would serve as a stopgap measure while the broader Allied response was organized. It was a bold move, committing the theater reserve before the full scope of the German attack was even known. Then came a moment that would become legendary in the annals of command relationships. Eisenhower pressed Bradley to move quickly to reinforce the Ardennes. Although Eisenhower was generally careful not to be seen as interfering directly in Bradley's command of his army group, the urgency of the situation demanded directness. Eisenhower pointedly suggested to Bradley, "I think you'd better send Middleton some help." Major General Troy Middleton commanded the 8th Corps, which was taking the brunt of the German assault. The question was which units to send. 2 uncommitted armored divisions were available. The 10th Armored Division was with Patton's 3rd Army in the south. The 7th Armored Division was with the 9th Army in the north. Both could potentially be shifted to the Ardennes, but there was a problem. Getting George Patton to give up a division, especially when 3rd Army was in the middle of its own offensive operations, was going to be difficult. Patton was notoriously possessive of his units and equally notorious for his volatile reactions when his operations were interfered with. Bradley was openly apprehensive. He knew the call he was about to make would trigger an explosion from Patton, but Eisenhower was in no mood for histrionics or debate. In one of the most memorable quotes of the entire battle, Eisenhower snapped at Bradley, "Tell him that Ike is running this damn war." That single sentence encapsulated everything about the command decision-making at that critical moment. Eisenhower was asserting his authority as supreme commander. He was making it absolutely clear that this was not the time for territorial disputes between Army commanders or for protecting individual operational plans. The German offensive was a theater-level threat, and it required a theater-level response. Personal preferences and pet operations would have to wait. It was early evening when General George Patton was summoned to the telephone at his 3rd Army headquarters. Patton was in the middle of planning his own offensive into the Saar region. 3rd Army was on the attack, and Patton was in his element. The last thing he wanted was to give up one of his armored divisions, but the order from Bradley was clear and unambiguous. The 10th Armored Division was to be committed immediately to the Ardennes. The division was to report to Troy Middleton at the town of Bastogne, which Middleton had already identified as a vital crossroads that absolutely had to be held. Patton's reaction was predictable. He protested loudly. He argued that pulling the 10th Armored out of his offensive would cripple his operations. But Bradley, backed by Eisenhower's authority and that memorable phrase about who was running the war, held firm. The 10th Armored was going to Bastogne, and that was final. Patton, for all his bluster, was also a professional soldier who understood orders. The division began moving that night. Meanwhile, that wedding reception went ahead as planned. Eisenhower and Bradley attended, though one imagines their minds were elsewhere. It was a surreal juxtaposition. Champagne and congratulations, while less than 200 miles away, American soldiers were fighting for their lives against overwhelming German forces in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. December 17th brought greater clarity, and with it greater alarm. The German offensive was not only continuing but expanding. The initial penetration was deepening, and new attacks were being launched along a widening front. By now it was becoming undeniably clear that this was not a spoiling attack or a local counterattack. This was a major offensive, carefully planned and powerfully executed. The Germans had achieved complete surprise, and they were exploiting it with shocking effectiveness. Eisenhower and his staff spent December 17th and 18th developing the broad outlines of the Allied response. The strategy had two phases. First, contain and delay the German counteroffensive, hold the critical terrain, particularly the river crossings and key road junctions. Deny the Germans the speed they needed for their plan to succeed. Second, once the German attacks were contained, prepare and launch a massive counterattack to destroy the German forces that had pushed into the Allied lines. Eisenhower ordered the two airborne divisions to move to the Ardennes by truck convoy. It was a race against time. He also summoned Major General Matthew Ridgway's 18th Airborne Corps headquarters from England to coordinate the airborne operations. The decision about where exactly to deploy the airborne forces, Eisenhower left to his staff to determine based on the developing situation. One of Eisenhower's most powerful weapons remained frustratingly unavailable. The Allied air forces, which had dominated the skies over Europe for months, were completely grounded. The same bad weather that had allowed the Germans to achieve surprise now prevented Allied aircraft from intervening in the battle. The Luftwaffe had chosen their moment well. The overcast skies and fog that blanketed the Ardennes made air operations impossible. Eisenhower's fighter bombers and heavy bombers, which could have devastated the German columns on the narrow Ardennes roads, sat idle on their airfields. But perhaps the most dramatic moment in the Allied command response came on December 19th. Eisenhower called a meeting at Verdun. This wasn't just any meeting. Verdun itself was loaded with symbolism. It was here, during the First World War, that French forces had held against a massive German offensive in one of the longest and bloodiest battles in history. The choice of location was deliberate. Eisenhower was sending a message. The Germans would not break through. They would not reach the Meuse River. They would be stopped, and then they would be destroyed. The attendees at the Verdun conference were the key commanders of the Allied forces. Eisenhower presided. Bradley was there, as were his army commanders. And of course, George Patton was present, summoned by Bradley the previous evening, with orders to report to Verdun to help determine the Allied response. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but determined. Eisenhower opened the meeting by setting the tone. According to accounts from those present, he insisted that this was an opportunity, not a disaster. The Germans had come out from behind their fortifications. They had exposed their armor and their remaining mobile forces in an offensive operation. Yes, they had achieved surprise. Yes, they had created a dangerous bulge in the Allied lines, but they had also created an opportunity to destroy German forces that might otherwise have prolonged the war for months. Eisenhower reportedly told the assembled commanders that he wanted only cheerful faces at the meeting. This wasn't whistling in the dark or denying the seriousness of the situation. It was a deliberate attempt to frame the crisis as an opportunity. The Germans had taken a massive gamble. The Allied response would ensure that gamble failed catastrophically. The commanders quickly agreed to halt offensive operations in all other Allied sectors. Everything would be concentrated on blunting the German drive in the Ardennes. Eisenhower's strategy was clear. Draw a stop line at the Meuse River. There would be no retreat beyond that line. The Germans would be contained on the eastern side of the Meuse. Once the German attacks were halted and their offensive power exhausted, the Allies would counterattack in force and destroy the Bulge. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. What happened next would become one of the most famous exchanges of the entire war. Eisenhower said, "George, I want you to command this move under Brad's supervision, of course, making a strong counterattack with at least 6 divisions." Then Eisenhower asked Patton when he could attack. The question seemed almost impossible. Patton's Third Army was currently engaged in offensive operations in the Saar, far to the south of the Ardennes. To disengage from that battle, turn 90 degrees north, move through winter weather on icy roads, and launch a coordinated attack into the southern flank of the German Bulge would require an extraordinary feat of military logistics and command. Most commanders would have asked for days, perhaps a week, to prepare such a complex maneuver. Patton's response electrified the room. He said he could have 2 divisions on the move the next day and a 3rd division ready within 24 hours if necessary. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Colonel Charles Codman, a member of Patton's staff who was present, later wrote that there was a stir in the room, a shuffling of feet, as those present straightened up in their chairs. Some faces showed skepticism. Could such a thing really be done? But through the room, Codman wrote, the current of excitement leaped like a flame. Eisenhower's son John, who later wrote about the battle, described the exchange as having an electric effect on everyone present. The prospect of disengaging 3 divisions from active combat, turning them 90 degrees north, and moving them over icy winter roads to launch a major counterattack in less than 72 hours was astonishing. Even for a group of officers accustomed to flexible military operations, this was audacious. Some in the room were skeptical. Was Patton overselling what Third Army could accomplish? Was this typical Patton bravado and showmanship? But Patton wasn't bluffing. When the inevitable questions came, he had specific, well-rehearsed answers. He laid out which divisions would be employed, what their objectives would be, how the boundaries between armies would be adjusted, and how much of Third Army's current sector would be taken over by General Jacob Devers's 6th Army Group to free up Patton's forces for the counterattack. Patton had actually been preparing for this possibility. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, had been closely monitoring German movements and had noted signs of a buildup. While Koch couldn't predict exactly where or when the Germans might attack, he had warned Patton that something was coming. Patton, characteristically aggressive, had told his staff that they needed to be in a position to meet whatever happened. So, when the call came from Eisenhower, Patton's staff had already done much of the preliminary planning. The speed of his response wasn't bravado. It was preparation meeting opportunity. Within an hour, virtually everything had been worked out. The divisions to be employed, the objectives, the new Army boundaries, the handoff of Third Army's sector to 6th Army Group. And virtually all of these decisions were settled on Patton's terms. Bradley later acknowledged that this was a greatly matured Patton. The Third Army staff had pulled off what Bradley called a brilliant effort. It was, many historians would later argue, perhaps the most remarkable hour of George Patton's entire military career. What Patton said publicly was confident and aggressive. What he thought privately was even more audacious. According to some accounts, Patton would have preferred to let the Germans drive even deeper, perhaps 40 or 50 miles into Allied territory, and then cut them off completely and destroy them in a massive encirclement. But he recognized, pragmatically, that he would never get support for such a daring and risky strategy. The political and public relations costs of allowing the Germans to advance that far would be unacceptable. So Patton settled for the more conventional approach of counterattacking as soon as possible to reduce the bulge and push the Germans back. While Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton were planning the southern response, another critical command decision was being made to the north. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group, was given authority over the American forces on the northern side of the German Bulge. This was a controversial decision. Placing American forces under British command was politically sensitive, and Montgomery's sometimes tactless public statements and his tendency to claim credit for Allied successes had already created friction with American commanders. But militarily, the decision made sense. The German offensive had split the Allied front. Communications between Bradley's headquarters and the American 1st and 9th Armies on the northern side of the Bulge were becoming difficult. Montgomery's headquarters was geographically better positioned to coordinate the northern response. And Montgomery, whatever his personal flaws, was an experienced and capable commander, particularly in defensive operations. Montgomery's response to the crisis was characteristically methodical. He swung his reserves southward to forestall any German attempt to cross the Meuse River in the north. He also reorganized the defensive positions to create a more coherent line. Montgomery's contribution to halting the German offensive, while less dramatic than Patton's wheeling maneuver from the south, was nonetheless crucial. The northern shoulder of the Bulge had to hold, and under Montgomery's coordination, it did. On the front lines, American commanders were making their own critical decisions and, in some cases, issuing their own memorable statements. At Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the 101st Airborne Division and attached units. The airborne troopers had been trucked to Bastogne in that frantic rush Eisenhower had ordered on December 16th. Now they found themselves surrounded as German forces bypassed the town and continued their drive westward. The Germans recognized that they couldn't leave such a strong garrison in their rear. Bastogne sat at a critical road junction. The Germans needed those roads for their supply lines and for moving reinforcements forward, so they surrounded Bastogne and demanded its surrender. The German ultimatum was delivered formally, as was the custom in such situations. It demanded that the Americans surrender or face annihilation. McAuliffe's response would become one of the most famous replies in military history. According to those present when McAuliffe received the German surrender demand, he read it, crumpled it into a ball, threw it in a wastepaper basket, and muttered simply, "Aw, nuts!" The officers in McAuliffe's command post were trying to formulate an appropriate official reply when Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard suggested that McAuliffe's first response actually summed up the situation perfectly. The others agreed. So the official reply, typed up and delivered by Colonel Joseph Harper to the German delegation, consisted of a single word: nuts. The German officers were confused. They didn't understand the American slang. When it was explained to them that it meant the same as "go to hell," they understood the message clearly enough. There would be no surrender at Bastogne. The garrison would hold, and hold they did. Despite being surrounded, despite being outnumbered, despite limited ammunition and supplies, the defenders of Bastogne refused to yield. Their resistance tied down German forces desperately needed elsewhere and denied the Germans the road network they required for their offensive. When Patton's Third Army counterattack finally broke through to relieve Bastogne on December 26th, the defense of the town was recognized as one of the epic stands of the war. Back at the higher command levels, the days following the Verdun conference saw the Allied response taking shape. Eisenhower's decision to commit the theater reserve immediately, his insistence on viewing the offensive as an opportunity rather than a disaster, and his willingness to override subordinate commanders when necessary, all proved crucial. Bradley's eventual acceptance of the severity of the threat and his coordination of the Army Group response, despite his initial underestimation of German capabilities, helped create a unified command structure. And Patton's lightning-fast reorientation of Third Army demonstrated what well-trained, well-led forces could accomplish even under the most challenging circumstances. On the northern shoulder of the Bulge, Major General Leonard Garreau's Fifth Corps exercised initiative that was lacking from some other headquarters. Garreau deployed his corps to confine the German penetration by defending the key terrain of Elsenborn Ridge. This defensive action, conducted in brutal winter conditions against overwhelming German attacks, became one of the outstanding defensive achievements of the entire war. By holding Elsenborn Ridge, Gero's forces prevented the Germans from widening the northern side of their bulge and accessing the better road networks they needed. One of the frustrating aspects for Eisenhower and the other Allied commanders was the delay in getting accurate intelligence about German intentions and capabilities. Even after the offensive was clearly underway, First Army headquarters struggled to accept the evidence in front of them. By early afternoon on December 16th, First Army's intelligence section had captured a copy of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's order of the day to German forces, which confirmed that an all-out offensive was underway. Yet as late as December 18th, First Army headquarters still had little clear idea of the status of the battle. Local commanders were reporting catastrophic breakthroughs in some areas, while other sectors held firm. The fragmentary and contradictory nature of these reports made it difficult to form a coherent picture. This intelligence confusion actually made Eisenhower's immediate recognition of the threat scale all the more remarkable. Without complete information, relying largely on intuition and his understanding of German operational patterns, Eisenhower grasped that this was a major offensive from the very beginning. His willingness to act on that conviction, to commit reserves and alter operational plans across the entire theater, showed decisive leadership at the most critical moment. As the days progressed and the weather began to clear, another factor entered the equation. The Allied air forces, grounded during the offensive's opening days, finally got into action. Fighter bombers and medium bombers struck German columns, supply lines, and reinforcement routes. The effect was devastating. The narrow Ardennes roads became killing zones. German vehicles, which had advanced rapidly during the foggy days, now found themselves trapped and vulnerable. Heavy bombers struck rail yards and bridges deep in German territory, making it increasingly difficult to sustain the offensive. The German plan had depended on two critical factors, surprise and speed. They achieved surprise completely. The Allied command was caught off guard, just as German planners had hoped. But speed was denied to them. American units, even when surrounded and outnumbered, held key positions longer than German planning had anticipated. The road network didn't allow the rapid movement German armor needed, and once the weather cleared, Allied air power made movement in daylight almost suicidal for German forces. By the end of December, the German offensive had been halted. The bulge in Allied lines remained, but it was no longer expanding. German forces had been unable to cross the Meuse River. They had been unable to capture the fuel supplies they desperately needed. And now they faced counterattacks from both north and south as Allied forces moved to reduce the bulge. What Allied commanders said when they realized the Ardennes offensive had begun ranged from Eisenhower's immediate conviction that this was a major threat requiring an immediate response, to Bradley's initial uncertainty, to Patton's aggressive confidence that Third Army could and would counterattack effectively, to Montgomery's methodical determination to hold the northern flank, to McAuliffe's defiant nuts at Bastogne. Each of these responses, in its own way, contributed to the ultimate Allied victory in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The battle would continue into January 1945. The Germans would be pushed back to their starting positions, having lost irreplaceable men and equipment they could not afford to sacrifice. The offensive, rather than changing the course of the war as Adolf Hitler had hoped, instead hastened Germany's collapse. The Ardennes offensive consumed the last mobile reserves and armor Germany possessed. When the Soviet Union launched its winter offensive in the east in mid-January, Germany had few resources left to resist. The initial Allied command response to the Ardennes offensive became a case study in crisis management and military decision-making. Eisenhower's immediate recognition of the threat, his willingness to commit reserves before the full picture was clear, and his insistence on treating the crisis as an opportunity demonstrated strategic thinking at the highest level. Bradley's coordination of the Army group response, once he fully grasped the situation, showed operational competence. Patton's rapid reorientation of Third Army displayed tactical brilliance and staff excellence, and Montgomery's methodical defense of the northern flank provided the stability that allowed the counteroffensive to succeed. The commander's statements and decisions in those first critical hours and days determined the course of the battle. When Eisenhower said, "Tell him that Ike is running this damn war," he was asserting command authority at a moment when clear authority was essential. When Patton promised to attack in 72 hours, he was committing Third Army to an operation that seemed almost impossible, but proved entirely achievable. When McAuliffe said, "nuts," he was expressing the spirit of resistance that would deny Germany the quick victory their plan required. If you found this detailed examination of the Allied command response fascinating, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of the command decision-making during the Battle of the Bulge interest you most? And don't forget to check out our other videos on World War II's critical moments. The story of what Allied commanders said and did when they realized the Ardennes offensive had begun is ultimately a story about leadership under pressure. It's about making decisions with incomplete information. It's about recognizing threats, even when intelligence services have failed to provide clear warning. It's about overcoming initial surprise and organizing an effective response despite the shock of a major enemy attack. And it's about the different leadership styles, from Eisenhower's strategic clarity to Patton's aggressive confidence to Montgomery's methodical defense to McAuliffe's defiant simplicity, all contributing to ultimate victory. The forests of the Ardennes had been a quiet sector on December 15, 1944. By December 16th, they had become the scene of the largest battle fought by the United States Army in the entire war. The Allied commanders' responses in those first hours and days shaped not just the battle, but the final months of the war in Europe. Their words, their decisions, and their leadership turned what could have been a catastrophic defeat into an eventual victory that broke the back of Germany's last offensive capability. The German gamble in the Ardennes failed. It failed because American soldiers fought with courage and determination in desperate circumstances. It failed because Allied logistics and reinforcement capabilities proved superior. It failed because Allied air power, once the weather cleared, dominated the skies. But it also failed because Allied commanders, from Eisenhower at the top to company commanders on the front lines, made the right decisions when it mattered most. What they said when they realized the Ardennes offensive had begun set in motion, the response that would win the Battle of the Bulge.